Welcome to the Nutrition Science Podcast, where we help you cut through the noise and make informed, science-based decisions about nutrition and your health. All right, welcome back to the podcast. Today, we are going to be discussing the Make America Healthy movement. I'm with my good friend, Dr. Jessica Knurick. She's been on the show before. She specializes in pregnancy and postpartum nutrition, but today we are going to be discussing this political movement because for those of you who are listening, who are outside of the U.S., and you're probably aware of this, but we had an election recently, and there's going to be a change in the administrative powers in the United States, and there's been a lot of talk about some actions that are being taken in order to promote a quote-unquote healthier America, and this is being led by Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who we'll talk a little bit about in this episode, and we'll discuss some of the thoughts that we have around this movement and also just some of the specifics around some of the actions that they're looking to implement and what we think about how that might impact the health of Americans. So Jessica, thanks for coming on.
Thanks for having me on again. Happy to be here with you.
Yeah, definitely. So let's go ahead and start by discussing kind of what this movement is. Can you just kind of break down so far like the gist of what you've seen around this Make America Healthy movement and why it's become so popular recently?
Yeah, so I think that what it is, it's a political movement aligned with a single political party. And so the whole idea is that this particular group is going to make America healthy again. Again, I'm not exactly sure what the word again means when we're going back to, but they want to improve the health of Americans because there are many truths that are coming out of this movement, right? About the health status of Americans. It's poor, right? Chronic disease rates are high. Obesity rates are high. And so they're using that and kind of creating this narrative about why that is that you and I likely don't agree with. And we'll talk about that. And creating solutions that are based in kind of fear and conspiracy instead of kind of looking at the actual health thing, like healthy actions that could improve the health of Americans. And so, but the goal, I think, is to kind of get people to realize there's a problem with the health status of Americans, which is great. There is. We should talk about actual solutions to that and really kind of rile people up about it in order to support a political party that says that they themselves are going to improve the health of Americans.
Yeah, great breakdown. One of the points that you made at the beginning that I think is really important for people to think about is when you hear these types of claims, these simple slogans like Make America Healthy Again, the first question that you have to ask is, when were we healthier? Because if we look at the history of the American population, yes, we have become more obese and diabetes rates have increased over time. However, we've also reduced our rates of death during infancy substantially through vaccinations. We've reduced rates of heart disease through medications, through awareness of LDL cholesterol. Like, there's a lot of people who think heart disease rates are higher now than they were 100 years ago, and that's actually the opposite. Heart disease rates are almost 1/3 the rate of what they were 100 years ago. We just live longer. So
Right.
more people who have heart disease because we don't die as much from infectious diseases due to vaccinations and other public health protocols that have helped to improve the health of our nation. So that's a first important point is, when was America healthy in the past? We have evolved in the things that we have to deal with in terms of our health status. 100 years ago, we needed to deal with infectious diseases. We've done a pretty good job of that. Now, we had a pandemic a couple of years ago, of course, and we had to readjust and make some new changes in order to deal with that. And now, in our current society, we are in a situation where the average American is generally not eating a very nutritious diet, is generally not exercising very much, not engaging in resistance training, not doing any type of cardiovascular exercise because our society and technology has allowed us to just move less. And so we just move less. And that has occurred over time. And now we're dealing with new problems, obesity, diabetes, and these things are, they're in our face. Everyone's aware of them. We've heard so much about the obesity epidemic and how it's causing problems. And so I think what this movement and what Jessica mentioned is this movement is highlighting those problems but offering a solution that may not be the proper solution. And that's what we want to discuss in this episode is some of the things that we think may be useful coming out of this movement, and then some of the other things that we just don't agree with and that we think are completely missing the mark in terms of actually improving population health.
Yep. Yeah, I would agree with all of that.
Yeah. So let's talk about what some of the main changes that are being proposed are, because there's some things that I've seen in terms of this movement gaining popularity and also gaining political support for one party. Because what
Mhm.
I've seen is that a lot of people voted for a specific party just because they're expecting this political movement to have the population health benefit that is being claimed. So I want to talk about, some of the main things that I saw come out of this movement overall that I saw people latch onto. And one of the main ones that I've seen is going after food companies and taking
Mhm.
away ingredients that are harming Americans' health. So we all know that when you go into a grocery store, there is there's thousands of different products that are often not very nutritious. They're easy to overeat, and people eating a lot of those is not having a positive impact on the health of Americans. And
Yeah, their
so,
packaging is bright and colorful to market
yeah,
towards
the packaging
kids.
is bright and colorful. They're
Yeah.
marketed well. They're marketed to children in ways that cause children to ask their parents for these things.
Mhm.
And we don't agree with a lot of this. Like Jessica and
Right.
I are both on the side of there definitely needs to be some better ways of practice, like better ways of practice in terms of the accountability for food manufacturers, the way that these things are marketed, and all of that. But we want to discuss like in terms of the ingredients and focusing on, okay, how do we regulate these ingredients to improve the health of Americans? We both feel like this is misguided. Can you speak about why that is the case, Jessica?
Sure. So, I mean, I just did a video about this, so I'll just kind of reiterate a lot of what I said. I think that if I made a list, and I'm just going to say 10 for ease of explanation, if I made a list of 10 things that could have an improvement on the health of Americans, the ingredients are going to be number 10, right? And so, after, we're dealing with a situation, and you kind of alluded to this, over 90% of Americans aren't eating enough fiber, aren't eating enough vegetables. 80% of Americans aren't moving their bodies, right? They're not meeting physical activity guidelines. And the majority of Americans aren't even walking. The average American walks 3,000 to 4,000 steps per day. And so, why is that? I mean, we can talk about all of the policies that a lot of it is cultural. And then there's a lot of policies that have resulted in kind of a food environment that's very inaccessible for a lot of people. We have 13.5%, almost 14% of US households experience food insecurity, where they don't even have enough, they don't even know where their next meal is coming from, or they don't have access to the foods that they need to meet their nutrient needs. And that includes almost 1 in 5 children who don't even have access to the nutrition that they need, that their bodies require. And so dealing with those things and working on those things from a public health perspective are going to be far more impactful. Working on the built environment so people can actually walk around and ride their bikes. And we can talk about all these things if we want to, but those things are going to have far more of an impact than food additives that by the way, undergo a large amount of research to ensure their safety. I mean, the Global Food Security Index ranks us third in the entire world, which is comprised of a British firm in the United Kingdom, not in America. We rank third in the US for safety of our food supply, right? So our food is not poisonous and it's safe. It's just the overconsumption of anything is going to have negative health impacts. And so targeting singular food additives, right? Targeting food additives and swapping out one preservative for a different preservative in a highly processed, nutrient devoid food is going to have almost no impact on health. And so, why are they focusing on that? Because it's a very easy rage baiting message, right? To get people really riled up. And it plays perfectly into their conspiratorial messaging to get you to not trust science, not trust government regulations or government agencies, not trust medical professionals. And so who do you trust? You trust them. And that's it.
Yeah, well said. And what you just said there, where it's creating a simple enemy, and
Yes.
that's much easier than what we just discussed, where it's multifactorial. There's, factors that have led to us exercising less. There's reasons why people don't have access to fresh food. Some people live in areas where maybe they don't have a refrigerator and there isn't a supermarket near them. And so they have to rely on highly processed foods. And this is the case with a lot of these food insecure homes. And there's many children, like you mentioned, where 20% of children are living in these food insecure homes where they probably don't even have a parent around to help to prepare them food. So they have to rely on some of these more highly processed options. I mean, I grew up in that environment. We didn't have a parent around or anyone for the most part until the evening and you had to rely on highly processed food options, chips and whatever else you could just grab and that don't require preparation because that's just not available. So those are important points and from a movement standpoint, from a marketing standpoint, because a lot of what this is marketing. We have to
Yeah.
learn how to recognize marketing for what it is. And I talk about this a lot on the podcast, but the way the effective marketing strategy in the health space is you create I mean in every space, but in the health space is what I know is you create a problem and it's a simple problem. So whether that be it's the meat and then you tell people to go vegan, or it's the plants and you tell people to go carnivore, it's the carbs and you tell people to go keto. It's the same thing that's happening here. It's the food companies that are poisoning everyone with these ingredients. So now we need to go regulate the food companies to take all of these things out of their food. But the reality is, if you ask any of these people who are in favor of regulating ingredients out of these foods, they can't give you a solid list of ingredients that show negative effects and that show benefits when you take them away from when you take it out of the food. So we would be regulating ingredients out of foods that we actually don't know if they're probably not going to benefit health at all when you take them out, but it makes for a really good story and it creates an enemy that a lot of people already feel is an enemy. It is like people already think of big food as a bad guy. And so it's just playing to that underlying, belief system that people have around big food being a bad guy and just taking it to an extreme and then offering a solution that isn't even a viable solution. But as long as you offer one, it doesn't really matter. You can just say that you're going to solve things, and people don't really look too much into what that actually means, unfortunately.
Well, and I think that also multiple things can be true at once, right? And a lot of us maybe don't have the capacity to hold space for that. So, for example, you're saying big food is the bad guy. There's a lot of things I can point to where big food is the bad guy, right? There's not this isn't some altruistic corporation that is looking out for the health of Americans. It's just not, right? That's literally what capitalism is. These companies are out there, which is fine. Like, this is I'm not a tirade against capitalism. It's just the reality of what that is. If you
That's how it's
have a
supposed to work.
system where these corporations are trying to maximize profits, they don't care about your health. That's not their goal. Their goal is to, make sure that they're meeting their whatever quotas for their shareholders and maximizing profits. And you do that by selling to more people and decreasing the cost of your products, right? And so a lot of times that results in a more unhealthy product. So that can be true, and it can be true that these food additives are not the major issue in our health. And it's the overconsumption of these highly processed foods that are a major contributor.
Yeah. So let's talk about that for a second. Overconsumption of highly processed food. So what's led us here? Why have we gotten to this point where we're over consuming these foods? What are the factors they're at play, and could we do something about that from a personal standpoint and also from a government standpoint?
Yeah, so I will give a little bit of insight into this, and then obviously I would love to hear your insight, especially as someone who grew up in this environment, as we've talked about many times. So policies have led us here, right? 100 years ago, starting in the 1930s, we started subsidizing particular crops: wheat, corn, and soy. Now, wheat, corn, and soy are fine by themselves. They're actually healthful crops, right? But because of that, these crops were very cheap to produce. And these crops became the basis for highly processed foods that were nutrient devoid and cheap. And we don't have those same. So we subsidize foods that don't have a ton of nutrition when they're used in these highly processed foods. By themselves, they do. But then, and we don't have those subsidies for things like produce. Produce is considered specialty crops. We still do this today, by the way. This was 1930s and all the way today. Produce is considered specialty crops and we don't subsidize them. So what has happened is we have a food environment where the cheaper, more accessible foods for people tend to be the highly processed, nutrient devoid foods, and the more expensive foods tend to be the nutrient dense foods. And so that has made it so that it's pretty inaccessible for a lot of people in the United States to eat what you and I would consider a healthful dietary pattern. Now, there's strategies and ways to overcome that. Like you and I, we both got our PhDs together. We love to play devil's advocate, right? We probably could play devil's advocate and be like, well, actually, you could create a whole, week of meals for this amount. And maybe you and I, with our knowledge, would be able to do that, right? But that is not what other people are, that's not the same as what other people are experiencing. And so what they're experiencing are a lot of different factors that are then making it so, oh, I'll just grab this bag of chips because it's 99 cents and it's going to give me 400 calories, right? Versus trying to make some sort of nutrient dense meal for 99 cents.
Yeah, I mean, the healthy choice is often the easiest choice. And
Yeah.
as you mentioned with the subsidies, I've talked about this in a podcast episode before. I don't think I went into too much detail about it, but I've alluded to it. This is definitely one of the reasons that there is an imbalance in terms of the cost of highly processed foods. So a Cheeto, like a bag of Cheetos, should actually cost more because that corn is being subsidized by the federal government. So taxpayer dollars help to reduce the cost of a lot of these highly processed foods that are made out of corn, wheat, soy, what are called commodity crops. And this wasn't a conspiracy or a huge conspiracy. Like this wasn't enacted as this huge conspiracy. It was to stabilize the food systems in the United
Right.
States to make sure that there was enough food during hard times. Now, sometimes things that have good intention have unintended consequences. So
Right.
as a result of that, we had extremely high amounts of these commodity crops, and food companies said, hey, well, we'll buy those off you at a lower cost and start to produce all of these other products that people enjoy because people are only going to eat so much corn and wheat that hasn't been processed into a Cheeto or processed into some other type of food. So
Right.
what happened was the good intention of helping to stabilize the American food system has contributed to allowing a lot of these highly processed foods to be basically saturated into the market at a very low cost. You walk around a school, now you have, these things in vending machines and they're very easy to eat. And unfortunately, as a result of that, because these things these foods can be offered at a low cost and these companies are making large amounts of profit off it, they can spend lots of money on food scientists and on helping to make these foods more hyper palatable. And there's a lot of benefit from food scientists in terms of helping to preserve foods, helping to make things more accessible, because we do want to reduce food waste. So processing foods can help to reduce food waste. Now, the way that we're discussing processing is, there's a variety of different reasonings for
Mm-hmm.
processing food. So processing a food to ensure that it has a longer shelf life, that it's more stable, that it is convenient, that it's accessible, that it's portable. There's many different positive benefits that can come from that. But as we discussed earlier, the United States is a capitalistic, opportunistic society where these food companies can, they just take the role of we want to sell as much product as we possibly can, as cheaply as we possibly can. And we're going to do that by creating delicious products at low cost and we're going to blast out marketing in every way that we possibly can to where that has contributed to the average American now eating 60% of their overall calories from these ultra processed foods.
And
And that is not a scenario that we want to be in.
And can I just say that, on this point, part of the messaging with this Make America Healthy Again movement, right, is that Americans are unhealthy because of corruption from scientists, scientific researchers, and government health authorities who are all conspiring to keep us sick. And so we can't trust science and we can't trust government health authorities. And it's just so uninformed, for lack of a better term, to think that I mean, when you just think about America and the economic system in America and capitalism and what that means, where the whole idea is for these companies to profit, and that has been the case for decades and decades and decades, why on earth would we think that Americans would end up well, would not end up sick? There's nothing helping Americans to stay well. Right? These corporations don't care about keeping Americans healthy. These corporations care about making money, and they make money by selling you and making you eat more food. Right? And so we're over consuming food. That's exactly what they want. They want us to be over consuming food. That's awesome for them. So it just boggles my mind that people don't understand that, like, it's the corporations who are literally just doing what companies do by trying to make as much money as possible, and no stopgaps being put into place to actually make sure that the health of Americans don't suffer to the point where they are suffering today.
Yeah, and we live in a society we have a political landscape where there has been a certain side of the political spectrum who has been strongly against regulations on
Strongly.
food companies. And it's not even the regulations on food companies that we think is important or could be beneficial. It's the other side of things that really this is where the focus needs to be placed, is why are people having to rely on these foods?
Hmm.
And why is it that these foods are more easily accessible? Why is it that people don't have access to fresh foods? Why is it that people don't understand the importance of doing that? And that's a much deeper issue that comes back to, like we said, the cost of food, but making that more accessible for people in certain scenarios, people, particularly income related individuals who are lacking access to food because of, lack of money, and they just don't have access. They can't go to a grocery store and buy fresh food, and they don't have the time to prepare it. And in many cases, this isn't going to be solved by regulating ingredients out of foods, unfortunately.
Right. Absolutely.
And so to piggyback off that point, one of the things that I've seen is that as a part of this movement and as a part of Robert F. Kennedy taking over power, which we don't know if this is actually going to happen, but Trump has promised that Robert F. Kennedy would have some type of power over some
I
of the
believe he
major
said he
health
could go
systems.
wild, quote
Yeah, to
unquote.
go wild on the quote unquote go wild. This is what he said on some of the health systems in the United States. And one of the things RFK has recently said is that he would like to get rid of the USDA Food and Nutrition Services Division. And this is based on what we've discussed. You'll understand why this is probably one of the worst possible ideas imaginable in terms of, improving population health and nutrition. Jessica, do you want to talk about why that would be the case if that really did happen?
Sure. So the entire thought of this Make America Healthy Again movement is that Americans are sick. Well, you have to look at which Americans are sick. And overwhelmingly, Americans who are in poverty have much higher rates of chronic disease, all chronic disease. And so there's something called the stroke belt in the southern United States. And you look at, if you take a map of the stroke belt, which is where the highest percentages of strokes happen, that's also strongly correlated with obesity and other cardiovascular diseases. And you put it over a map of poverty, and it's very close. Right. So poverty is, one of the greatest predictors of health in this country is wealth. Right. So the more money you have, the healthier you are. And so poverty is strong.
Stat on that. There's actually an over 20, I think it's about 25-year health gap, like a life expectancy gap between the lowest income zip codes and the highest income zip codes.
I am not shocked by that.
So yeah, to speak to that, probably the most important predictor is poverty because of the reasons that we're going to discuss.
Yeah. And so, okay, so you have this situation where people in poverty, they have food insecurity issues, right? They don't have always access to food. And when they do, they're having to choose these low-cost options because of our food environment. And so a lot of people might not know that the USDA is who runs the programs like SNAP and WIC. So SNAP is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. It was formerly called food stamps. WIC is Women, Infant, and Children. It's meant to help pregnant women and their children. And so these programs help give people who are in poverty access to food. First of all, access to food, period. And second of all, access to healthful foods. So there's a lot of things within SNAP that help to incentivize people to purchase fruits and vegetables. For example, they have like double up bucks in a lot of states where you get double the money if you're spending it on fruits and vegetables. And there's also something called SNAP Ed where they're teaching about they're educating about healthful choices and healthful food choices. So these programs are incredibly essential for this particular demographic of people who are experiencing high rates of chronic disease and poor health status. And the assertion that you want to help the health of Americans by what? By getting rid of a coloring agent in Fruit Loops, while removing access to these funds for the most vulnerable population in the US with regard to health status is wildly ridiculous. Right. And I think he's banking on people just not even understanding what the USDA does, not understanding these very complicated issues, and people just thinking that their food is poisoned and that's why everybody's sick.
Yeah. And the USDA isn't protecting us. So we need to get rid of that department because they haven't protected us to this point, which, like you just said, yes, SNAP and WIC, but the USDA also runs the school lunch program, which offers after like basically summertime lunches, and that's for like whole families, like for people who are in food insecure environments. They also offer programs for giving food for veterans who are in food insecure homes, for older adults as well. Like there's a program for adults over 60 who are facing food insecurity. The USDA Food and Nutrition Services is literally the safety net to ensure that the people who are experiencing the highest levels of chronic disease have access to any food, much less nutritious food. And this is the complete opposite of trying to make America healthy again. When I heard that tweet, that was mind boggled by that. Like that, I don't think, to be honest, we just got to be honest here. I don't think RFK knows what the USDA Food and Nutrition Services
These people have no experience in public health. They don't know.
Yeah, like unfortunately, I don't think he even knows what that department is meant for, and he's just saying things that he knows is going to rile up the public. So if you created the enemy, which the enemy is the current government health systems are all failing America, and the corporations are destroying your health. So now we're going to go after that enemy, and we're going to go after that enemy by, they're definitely not regular. I don't get this part of it. They're not They're not going to regulate food companies. He's going to be working for the administration that is like the most anti-regulation administration possible. Like there's no way they're going to be regulating food companies and cutting into big business profits. But if they're doing that, like this makes no sense. It's not addressing the underlying factors that are actually influencing Americans and influencing our health, and it is truly causing many people to buy into these conspiracies around the government and around scientists and around health professionals. And unfortunately, you will see if you get on social media and you see any of the posts that I've done or any of the posts that Jessica's done, you will find that there are overwhelmingly 95% or more of scientists, healthcare professionals, and people who work in this space who are deeply impacted by these things trying to speak out against it. And then you have other individuals who bought into the messaging, have zero experience with nutrition or healthcare or any of these topics, but they bought into some of the messaging that RFK and the other MAHA, Make America Healthy Again influencers have been consistently putting out that is mostly misleading. It has really influenced people's worldview in a negative way to the point where And a lot of people think that the government and food companies are after them and this person's going to save them. And this is so far from the truth. Like, when, if some of these policies get implemented and you are currently not exercising regularly, not lifting weights regularly, eating a diet that is not very nutritious,
Not eating enough
you're
fiber.
still going to be doing that afterwards. None of these policies are going to impact you in any way.
Oh.
Like, yeah, I don't understand this side of it where people think that it's just going to change the behavioral patterns of the United States population. We talked about, the food insecurity aspect. We could go on for a long time talking about some of the other policies that would actually have some positive benefit. Jessica
Well,
mentioned.
before we move on, can we just I think it's important to give like concrete examples too. So under the USDA, as you mentioned, is the National School Lunch Program, right? And I think that in this community, this Make America Healthy Again community, they point to the corruption of the USDA because the school lunches are unhealthy, right? And what people don't understand and realize is that the constraints that these experts and professionals in the school lunch programs are working under to create healthful lunches, right? And so everyone's like, "Oh my gosh, we should be giving them way healthier lunches." And sure, but let's talk about the nuance there, right? In the contiguous 48 states, right, outside of like Alaska and Hawaii, they are given $4.01. That's the national average. $4.01. They have to create a healthful meal that meets all of the food groups, right? Fruits, vegetables, whole grains for under $4.01. Okay, so they have to try to figure out how to get the most nutrition in for that amount. And people are really upset about the National Nutrition Program, and that it's not as healthy as they would like to have it be. Well, I would urge anyone to try to create some healthful meals for under $4.01 that kids will actually eat, because that's the other side of it, right? So they have done this in the past, and the Democratic Party has put a lot of legislation forward over the last couple of decades, starting, as far back as Michelle Obama with her healthy, what was it called? It was like Healthy Hunger
I don't,
Free Act, I believe it was
yeah,
called, and which the other party at the time called government overreach, too expensive and wasteful, right? And the whole goal was just to improve school nutrition programs. The idea has been to fund the National School Lunch Program in order to be able to improve the quality of those lunches, because it's again, $4.01 is just silly in order to be able to do that. And so if you fund it, you can enhance the nutritional quality. And so I think people don't understand the constraints. So the Biden administration earlier this year, they passed legislation to reduce the amount of added sugar in the school lunch program, right? Which is very interesting, because this is also something I'm hearing a lot in the Make America Healthy Again community. Like, there's too much sugar and they never cared. And they just passed something earlier this year that's set to go into effect in 2025, which lets all watch them take credit for lowering sugar standards. But what's interesting is I've talked to some of the people who work in the school lunch program, and we would consider that a win, right? Decreasing the sugar in these lunches, but it's actually causing a lot of issues for them, because they're already having to work under so many constraints. They have to meet the whole grains, and they have to meet the vegetables, and they have to meet the fruits under $4.01. And then you add something else on top of that, and it's like Tetris, right? You're trying to like figure out how to piece everything together. And so it wasn't a welcome change, as you and I might think from a nutrition standpoint.
I read several papers around this when I was doing my PhD of failed efforts just like this. And we always think, because, and you and I used to be the same way, like going into our PhDs, we used to be very idealistic about everything. We need to reform school lunches. We need to, take all of these things out of the food. I mean, Jessica and I met quite a long time ago at the beginning of our PhD programs,
Mhm.
and her and I both were slightly in the side of some of this conspiratorial thinking as well, because
We would have been in the Make America Healthy Again movement, you and I.
possibly at some point, I don't know about PhD time, but
No,
some point
but
before that.
before, when we were coming in.
Yeah, definitely. And it's because these things are attractive. And when you eat healthier and you feel better and you see the benefit from it, and unfortunately, sometimes a lot of health information is just presented with conspiratorial thinking, because that's
Mhm.
the way to get people to buy into what you're doing. If you tell some story about some bad guy, it's the best way to market things. And so oftentimes when you're trying to learn about nutrition, you fall into some of these conspiracies. And I mean, I used to be extremely anti-pharma. I didn't go to the
Oh yeah.
doctor for years
Remember
because
all
I
the
was
books,
like,
the books you and I read,
yes, yes.
anti-pharma
So,
books?
so we understand. We have been through this process of believing some of these things, being extremely idealistic about thinking that all of the government needs to be working in this way and we should be providing the best school lunches possible and we should be giving people fresh salads for lunch and all of that great stuff. But
Mm-hmm.
but when you dig deeper, there's just so much nuance to everything and there's so many other factors that need to be taken into consideration that aren't being discussed.
Right.
And when you get these one-liners of make America healthy again, we're going to dismantle the USDA because they're destroying the health of Americans, like you're not actually hearing the whole picture. And with this, one of the things that opened my eyes is one of the studies that I read, and I actually heard someone present about this. They implemented a salad bar it was in like a whole school district. They did salad bars in all the schools, and they lost so much money, and it was the worst feedback because very few kids were actually eating salads. It was a lot of work. They were wasting a lot of fruits and vegetables that were just going bad.
Yeah,
And
they were throwing a ton of food away, weren't they?
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And that was one of the studies that I read early on, when I used to have these idealistic thoughts about the school lunch program as well. Like I used to always say that, why are school lunches this way? And then I
Mm-hmm.
read that study and I was like, wow, this is a lot more complicated than I expected. There is so many factors, the preparation, the storage, buying the food and making sure that you can buy enough of, yeah, it's great to say that you want to have fresh fruits and vegetables, but can we buy enough for the whole district and be able to keep them fresh long enough so that you can make the meals? That's a different challenge. And all of these challenges often don't get taken into consideration when we just think, yeah, the kids should be eating healthier. I agree with that. I
Yeah.
wish the school lunches were much more nutritious, but we have to take a step back sometimes and not get too caught up in these one-liners and these stories. Anytime you start to hear something that makes you go down a rabbit hole where you feel like you're believing some conspiracies, it's a good time to take a step back and try to look at the whole picture because it's really easy to get sucked into these things. And, oftentimes there's just more to the story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
So there's many other things that were a part of this Make America Healthy movement. So one of the other things that I saw mentioned that I don't want to spend much time on, but I will, if you're listening to this and you want to learn more about this, fluoride, taking fluoride out of water, that it was one of the other proposals that has been made. There's a guy, Dr. Ids, he's been on the podcast before. He just did an Instagram post detailing this topic. So I will link that in the show notes, and I recommend going and checking that out. If you're curious about fluoride and water, I've been getting a lot of questions about that. People are worried about that. People seem to be worried about the ingredients. People seem to be worried about the FDA and USDA, like not protecting our health, which, as Jessica mentioned, they are. There are standards for all of this. There isn't, food companies aren't just allowed to put anything they want into foods. The last thing that I want to discuss, and this is something I've talked about on this podcast before, but it's another thing that just has surprised me, is one of the things that RFK mentioned was like banning seed oils or taking them out of foods. I've seen him mention seed oils multiple times. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, as you mentioned, I think at the start of the podcast, like generally my content is focused on pregnancy and postpartum and like the young children, right? So I don't actually spend a ton of time talking just about general nutrition. When I talk about seed oils, I talk about it in the sense that they're included in every single infant formula all around the world, right? And so I think that actually is a great example of how wellness influencers are misleading us about the dangers of seed oils, because there's a big push in the formula. People like to fearmonger formula standing in grocery stores, just like they like to do anything, right? And they always grab a hypoallergenic formula to fearmonger it. And they always point to seed oils. And those same people will tell you that the formula here in the US is terrible for you and they're, the government's out to keep your baby sick, and then point to European formulas being much more healthful. And I just want everyone to know every single infant formula all around the world, including in Europe, this like place we're putting on this pedestal for health. But only when it comes to food additives, not any of their other policies that they have, like universal healthcare or anything like that. But so when they talk about European formula, they all have seed oils. So my question would be, if seed oils are this boogeyman that is keeping everybody unhealthy, why would we include every country all around the world where all of the evidence states that we need seed oils be included in formula? And the reason is because they have a fatty acid profile of polyunsaturated fats that very closely mimic breast milk, as close as you can get. And so I wanted to just say that about formula. And then I know you have a lot more to say than I do about seed oils, but my whole thing with seed oils is just like it is with anything, just like it is with sugar, just like it is with everything. If you overconsume anything, it's going to be problematic, right? And so if seed oils are used in a lot of highly processed nutrient devoid foods because they're cheap, and remember, we're trying to maximize profits here, and they don't have a strong flavor profile, right? And so they're really useful in those foods. And so when people are over consuming them and not consuming a lot of omega-3 fatty acids, right, because nobody eats fish, then that can cause an issue. And that's the issue. That's the nuanced issue. But seed oils are not this like enemy that everyone's made them out to be.
The piece with seed oils for me, because I've talked about it on podcasts before, and I'll link the seed oil podcast I did with Dr. Ids if anyone wants to go into depth about seed oils and all the different misinformation around that. Is this would actually come down to making a policy based on complete wellness misinformation. Like there's
pseudoscience, as they say.
Yeah, when we look at studies and people eat less seed oils and more saturated fat sources from animal foods, there is only negative health effects. And the proposition from a policy standpoint is removing these seed oils and replacing them with butter and coconut oil and other
because what else would
saturated fat sources? Yeah, what other cheap fat sources can the food companies put into those foods? There's multiple studies, and I talked about this with Dr. Ives on the Seed Oil podcast. There's multiple studies that show that will increase LDL cholesterol, increase inflammation, and have negative effects on our health. Yet that is something that may potentially be implemented as a policy that will cost the United States, that will cost food companies lots of money. And the consequence of that would be negative health effects on our population.
Yes.
This is just couldn't get more backwards in more ways. It's one thing to go after things that there may be questionable health implications of, like, okay, Red 40, there is some evidence to show that it may potentially cause some negative health effects in certain circumstances, but most likely not.
Exacerbate symptoms of ADHD in children with ADHD.
Yeah, so if a kid has ADHD, they eat a lot of Red 40, they could potentially exacerbate their symptoms. That's the only negative effect that's been shown with this. And they're going after this, and then like that slight justification there. With the seed oil thing, it's completely backwards than what the science shows. And that's the piece that's just like, truth is gone. Like, there is no semblance of truth if some of these things start to get implemented. And now it's just whatever we can get people to believe is now the new policy driver.
It's a good point. Do you know if they ever talk about the implications of what they're talking about? So, for example, if you remove seed oils from the food supply, the implications of that for grocery prices, for example, right? And like getting rid of the USDA, do they ever talk about the implications of that? Or is it just really just outrage?
Just outrage. I saw one video where RFK said, people think fast food is unhealthy, but it's not the fast food that's unhealthy. It's the seed oils that it's cooked in. Oh my God, I
saw that too.
When I was a kid, they used to use tallow, and it was actually healthy for you. I mean, it's not about truth, unfortunately. So, I mean, we're gonna end it here because we could probably go on a really long rant, and I want to make sure that we cover the points and we don't go into too much depth about the way we feel about some of these things. But But, if you can't tell, Jessica and I are both just concerned about the direction that things are going to go in these next several years. You had something to say?
I just wanted to say that a lot of the times when we're talking about this, I've noticed just on social media when I'll make a video kind of correcting misinformation, I will get a lot of comments that are like, "You believe that processed foods are healthy? Like, what kind of health professional are you?" And they're hearing something that's just not being said. Clearly, I mean, you and I have dedicated nearly half our lives to this, right? Learning about nutrition, studying about nutrition and the health implications of, I mean, we were our PhD program, what was the title of it? Physical activity, nutrition and wellness in the College of Health Promotion. Like
Yeah.
that has been what we've been doing for years and years and years. And to the assertion that we just don't care about people's health and we think that, everybody should just be eating these highly processed foods with a bunch of food additives is just so silly. And it's just that the food additives, focusing on them is missing the forest for the trees, right? And we're not targeting kind of things that can be really impactful. Both you and I would probably say, we should, when we can, center our diets around nutrient dense foods as much as possible, eating fiber, eating things like beans and protein sources, and getting adequate nutrition and moving our bodies. And just doing those two things, sleeping well, getting outside in some sunlight, right? Those things are going to are going to have the biggest bang for your buck. And so I like to just talk about those and not even bring politics into it. It's just this has been so overly politicized, and our policies do have a direct impact on a lot of these things, accessibility of food for people, for example. And that unfortunately we've kind of been forced to now talk a little bit about politics. But at the end of the day, like, we know what can help to keep people healthy. And food additives, again, as I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, is literally at the bottom of that list. And so I want to make it really clear and not have there be any confusion as to, I mean, you have this podcast, so I'm sure there's no confusion about where you stand, but that then most people in this space all are saying the same thing: eat, wholesome foods, move your body, get outside. It's very simple, really. Simple, not
Yeah.
easy, but simple.
Yeah. And one of the points you said, I mean, you and I, you said half of our lives, like, this is all we've ever done.
Yeah.
I know your path, my path too. This is all Jessica and I have done our entire adult lives. Like, we went into this space, the health space, right out of high school, and we have both dedicated our entire lives to working in this field. And we both worked in a variety of different settings, in a variety of different, environments. We have a variety of different experiences. And it's not that we are these scientists that are a part of this global conspiracy. And I really want to make that incredibly clear. And I would recommend that if you're listening to this, because I know most people listen to this, you already know all this stuff. So I recommend, just if you can, you have a family member who's kind of on the side of thinking this Make America Healthy Again movement is going to transform the health of Americans and is on all supporting that, I'd recommend sending them this podcast and, kind of explaining it in that way. Like, these are two people who have dedicated their lives to working in this field of nutrition and health promotion to try to help people become healthier. We're not against that at all. We just want to make sure that things that people are focusing on and supporting are the things that are actually going to help our country to move forward in a healthier way. And those things are helping to provide better safety nets for populations who are at high risk, trying to create more environments that are more walkable, more spaces for people to play outside in parks, and investing in those type of things. Like, that's where we need to be spending money, improving access to healthcare, which is outside of our scope in terms of nutrition. And we didn't want to spend a lot of time on that today, but it's also a very important one. 20-30% of the population doesn't have access to healthcare on a regular basis. And we are one of the very few developed countries where that's the case. I work with clients all over the world. We have the worst healthcare system by far.
Yeah.
Like, all of my clients who have health issues, when they need testing or when they need treatment, it is easier everywhere, and they don't have to worry about random bills that come in the mail. And this is what we need to be talking about if we want to make America healthy.
I just wanted to say one thing about this, because I did a post about Fruit Loops and the cost of Fruit Loops compared to this really high priced cereal the other day. and Fruit Loops was like $4.29 for like 19 ounces. And somebody posted from Australia and they were like, Fruit Loops are that cheap in the United States? They're like 12, like $10, I think they said here in Australia. And somebody commented back to them, they're like, well, at least you guys have universal health care, right? She was like, yeah, that's a good trade-off. So I just thought
Yeah.
that was funny. I mean, but it also kind of speaks to how cheap Fruit Loops are here because of everything that we talked about, right? Versus other countries, they have to spend more for that kind of food.
Yeah, and it's where their priorities are. Their government's spending more money on universal health care and less money on subsidies, and
Yep.
ours is putting more money into the subsidies and less on the health care.
Yeah. Yeah. And I would say, just as a word of encouragement to some of us who might feel uh, not encouraged right now. I have been sharing a lot about like just the other side of Make America Healthy Again, right? And more of the nuance. And I'll tell you that there's a lot of people out there right now who are receptive to hearing it. Right. And a lot of people just have never heard the other side. They've never heard the evidence-based side because, as you say, the stuff that spreads very quickly and very easily is the outrage content, the conspiratorial content, the pseudoscientific content that is like, oh my gosh, is that true? That's crazy. And the nuance. I mean, look at you and I just spent however long just talking about a few things. We could go on for hours. And there's just so much nuance to each one of these factors. And that doesn't do well on social media, right? And so I've had many people, because I've had some videos about this. People seem to be quite interested about learning about it right now. And so they're doing well. And I've had people in my DMs tell me that they've never even been presented with this side. They've never thought about it, and that it's really helped them to open their eyes to think more critically when they see posts like that. And so I do think that there's people out there who are receptive. They just haven't had the opportunity to hear from people who, like, nutrition scientists, food scientists, public health experts, right? And so, as you say, sharing the content of those people can be really helpful to get it in front of more people.
That's a really good point. And of course, we sound self-serving with this, but
Yeah, that does sound
elevating the
self-serving, but that's
voices,
really not the point.
elevating the voices of health professionals, scientists who work in this field, because there are rational discussions being had. Like, we aren't here to say, oh, if you voted this way, you're a terrible person and you did something wrong or whatever. But we want people to understand what you may be supporting, and also understand the reality of our health circumstances in the United States. They're not great, but the things that we can do to fix them, aren't going to be found in some of the things that are being promoted. And the more people we can get to understand what the real issues of our country are, the more people we can get to be talking about these things, and hopefully come next election cycles, we can piggyback off of this movement and make some changes that would be helpful.
Yeah, like let's have some genuine conversations about how to help. I mean, if you look at Make America Healthy Again, do they include a single nutrition scientist, a single food scientist, or a single public health expert? No, they don't, right? So they're not serious about actually understanding the issues and trying to solve the health problems of America. And you can just look at literally that point right there to know that they're not serious about it.
Yeah, yeah, truly. Well, thanks for coming on. I appreciate the discussion, and I am not looking forward to, but we'll see how this plays out. And I
Yeah.
know that you're still going to be continuing to push back and speak out against it, as will I.
Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, for sure.